Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to this webinar on the road to COP26, organized by UNDP Sweden. My name is Marika Samuelsson, and I'm the project officer here at UNDP Sweden, and I will be moderating this webinar today. This webinar series, this seminar is part of a webinar series called Reimagining Development. The series aims to contribute to a deeper conversation about the future of development by exploring how we together can reimagine the ways in which we tackle today's challenges. Before we start, I would just like to mention a few things on the technical side. This video is being recorded in order to be shared afterwards. Participants have been muted and their videos have been disabled. So if you can hear me and see me, as well as the speakers, everything is working properly. We encourage you to submit your questions throughout the webinar, and you can do so in the Q&A function at the bottom of your dashboard. We may not get through all of your questions, but I promise that we will do our very best. In this webinar, we will start off with a few opening remarks from each of the speakers before we continue to a discussion in the Q&A section. So I would first like to set the stage for this webinar. We have 7 months left until the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, where world leaders are going to gather to accelerate action towards the goals of the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Paris Agreement works on a 5-year cycle of increasingly ambitious climate action carried out by countries in their plans known as nationally determined contributions, NDCs. COP26 is particularly important because it's the first time that countries are expected to enhance these plans since the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015. And the conference has already been postponed once due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And its outcomes plays a pivotal role in how we collectively address climate change, one of the most pressing issues of our time. So in this webinar, we will discuss what's at stake, what the road to COP26 looks like, and how we together can work to accelerate climate action. And without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our distinguished panel. We have Janine Alm Ericson, State Secretary to Sweden's Minister for International Development Cooperation. Joining us from New York, we have Cassie Flynn, UNDP Climate Change Advisor. Joining us from Ecuador, we have Matilde Mordt, UNDP Resident Representative in Ecuador. And last but not least, we have Fredrika Andersson, Sweden's Youth Representative to COP26. A big welcome to you all. We're so excited to have you here. And to kick off this webinar, I'd first like to address the first question to the State Secretary. State Secretary, could you please tell us how Sweden, together with partners, are working together to improve the prospects for an ambitious outcome from COP26? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Marika, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this very important subject. As we all know, our planet is in a state of climate crisis. Global heating is accelerating. Around the world, tropical storms, floods, wildfires, droughts, and other disasters are becoming more frequent and intense. The catastrophic impacts of climate change are no longer a future threat. We have an ongoing climate crisis, putting communities at risk, sowing the seeds of hunger, new pandemics, mass migration and conflicts, and undermining businesses to flourish. The World Bank estimates that in sub-Saharan Africa alone, climate change may trigger the migration of 70 million people by 20 2050. The climate crisis is twofolded. We are losing biodiversity in an alarming speed, partly because of climate change. At the same time, healthy ecosystems are essential for our survival and for climate adaptation. The climate crisis and the nature crisis are interlinked and must be addressed in concert. The way we interact with the environment and put human rights, gender, equality, and women's empowerment into focus for support will make a difference for a more inclusive future, response, and recovery in the wake of COVID-19. When it comes to fighting climate change and its effect, we are all interlinked. Climate change is also a driver for conflict and poverty. We see that groups and societies in vulnerable situations are the hardest hit by effects of climate change. So how can poor countries be supported to strengthen their climate ambitions and scale up impact for long-term sustainable socioeconomic development? I would argue that all countries have a responsibility of their own to be climate smart. Producing locally owned NDCs are the starting point to identify challenges as well as opportunities, building resilience and adaptation. I would also argue that we need to work more together, not less. Communication, partnership, and leadership are key. Support must be tailor-made to each partner country's needs and incentivize green transition. UNDP has an important role to play in this regard, including through the initiative Climate Promise, which Sweden supports. The EU also plays a vital role in the green transition as the world's largest donor, providing more than 50 billion euros per year to support poverty alleviation and advancing global sustainable development. A broad implementation of the EU Green Deal, where all EU instruments are used in a coherent way, will make a difference. What we need now is a rapid and ambitious phasing out of fossil fuels, and in particular coal, including subsidies. We must integrate nature and biodiversity in all our efforts. The quality of our support to partner countries is vital for them to do more. We all need to do more. The world's biggest polluter, the USA, China, together with the EU, must lead by example in close interaction with the private sector, civil society, the UN family, and the international community. We are now experiencing the devastating effects of a pandemic, but there is also a growing realization that the health of people and planet are linked together. Improving health goes hand in hand with addressing the climate crisis. We need to ensure that all development financing is built on sustainability and to be a force for a green future. Developed countries must increase their efforts to mobilize climate finance for the period until 2025. This goes for both public and private finance, where private finance is of utmost importance to reach the investment volumes needed. The Swedish government budget bill for 2021 is the greenest in history and includes 10 billion Swedish crowns in green recovery measures, as well as green credit guarantees amounting to 25 billion Swedish crowns. All rich countries need to be part of raising resources to deliver on our joint $100 billion per year goal for climate financing. But while external climate financing is important, the true change need to be the climate and environment is streamlined into everything we do. Each country, rich and poor, have a responsibility of their own to shape policies and regulations conducive to sustainable development and a climate and environmentally friendly future. Human rights, gender equality, women's empowerment are at the foundation of a fair, inclusive, and equal. Biodiversity and healthy ecosystems are at the center for sustainable development and poverty reduction, food security, and livelihoods. Clear and ambitious targets and timetables will help us to measure results and progress towards sustainability and a green, peaceful future. This is the way Sweden approaches the global green transition. And I firmly believe this is the way forward in reducing poverty, contributing to sustain peace, and building back better and greener societies in the wake of COVID-19. This is how we take the Paris Climate Agreement and Agenda 2030 into real action and make COP26 a success. We now have less than 10 years to cut emissions in half, while at the same time fulfilling the 2030 agenda. Let us use this urgency of climate action and the need to tackle COVID-19 as a tool to build back better and greener for a sustainable future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, State Secretary, for those opening remarks, giving light to the context that we're facing. And I believe this is a great segue to Cassie, as you mentioned UNDP's role. Cassie, could you please tell us, how does UNDP work to support countries in enhancing their climate ambitions? Over to you.
Thank you, Marika. And first, I have to say just what a pleasure it is to be on this panel with such a distinguished set of women. It's such a treat. And I was thinking today about the title of this, Rethinking Development. And I think that this really cuts to what UNDP's approach is, and certainly as we have had such a close partnership with Sweden in this work, really thinking about how we can use climate as an entry point, as a gateway to really help countries as they're at this moment where we have to rethink everything. And this is what COVID has taught us. And in this moment, what UNDP is really trying to do is to help to give countries the tools and the information and the partnerships and the networks to be able to help bring that rethinking to life. And one of the big examples of this, and Marika, you mentioned the nationally determined contributions of the Paris Agreement. And right now, the pressure is on. We need countries to be as ambitious as possible under the Paris Agreement. But this requires, back to this rethinking, it requires a whole rethinking of how economies work. And in 2019, UNDP launched our Climate Promise. And this is our effort to support as many countries as we can to be as ambitious as possible. And it started with the goal of 100. We're now at 118. And it certainly wouldn't have been possible without the close partnership. And I say this very, very meaningfully with Sweden. We have been really figuring out how to best support countries in close collaboration with Sweden, and really trying to think about how we can bring together all the various pieces of sustainable development to the climate crisis. And so what this means is that among all of these 118 countries, what we're trying to do is help them to be ambitious when it comes to their targets. And we've seen now among the 118 Climate Promise countries, we have about 73% that are wanting to reduce emissions and be more ambitious when it comes to mitigation. And this is a really, really exciting number because we want as many countries to be doing this as possible. And certainly we've got examples all over the world, from Lebanon to Nepal to Rwanda. And then, of course, I know we're going to hear from Matilde about the fantastic leadership of Ecuador. And along with this, of course, is adaptation. How can we increase our resilience to the impacts of climate change? How we can protect the communities that are most vulnerable among us. And we have a really incredible 96% of the Climate Promise countries that are increasing the ambition when it comes to adaptation. And this, I think, really reflects also the time that we're in. People are very vulnerable, and this is what COVID has taught us. And I think being able to make big choices that help to increase the resilience of communities around the world is something that has certainly become a priority. But beyond these sort of the targets, and I want to really touch on something that the State Secretary said that I think is so important, which is this idea of integration. And this idea of how can we not just be about the targets, but actually be about impact. And how do we do that? And being able to use the NDC as essentially a gateway to various engines of sustainable development. Nearly every single NDC has an energy target. Many have targets that relate to biodiversity, nature-based solutions, and forests. Over half are linking to green recovery. And how can we take that and really provide, again, sort of this connection and these tools to bring these targets off the page, off the piece of paper that they're written on, and turn them into impacts for people on the ground. And this is something that we are working very hard with our climate promise, but also with UNDP's broad portfolio. We're working closely with our human rights colleagues, with our gender colleagues, with our elections colleagues, to think about how we can bring all of this together. And then the third thing I really wanted to mention is on inclusivity. We have learned over and over and over again that really ambitious climate action cannot happen without not only everybody at the table, but everybody equipped to be able to be a part of that impact for the long term. It's not just about a singular conversation. It's not just about a singular day or a singular moment, but instead being able to ensure that marginalized communities, that women, people with disabilities, young people have what they need to be a part of this. And certainly with the climate promise, we've been really paying very close attention to this. And we know that 97% of the NDCs as a part of the climate promise include a gender responsive component. We know that 75 are including youth, which is orders of magnitude over what the first generation of NDCs had. And I think this is a real credit. And Fredrika, I'm looking at you and all of your colleagues and the inspiration that you have provided to all of us about ensuring that future generations are a part of this in a very meaningful way. So as you can see, when we're thinking about climate change and we're thinking about NDCs, it is really about this rethinking development. How can we do things differently? And how can we do them at a speed and scale that we need to be able to respond to this crisis that is, quite frankly, at our doorsteps right now? And I'm continually inspired by the governments that we work with. I'm continually inspired by those that are a part of this fight. And I'm really looking forward to continuing that work collectively together. So thank you, Marika.
Thank you, Cassie. So interesting. And I think it's great to get that, broad overview of UNDP's work in general and the climate promise. And I would just like to get some more concrete examples, a country perspective of how we work and implement the climate promise. So Matilde, how is that? How does that happen in Ecuador? How do you deliver impact on the ground?
Yes, thank you, Marika. And well, thank you for inviting me to this panel. It's always nice to be part of these initiatives that involve Sweden, which I'm originally from. So definitely, UNDP has been supporting Ecuador since many years in the climate change field, in different areas, as regards to mitigation, adaptation, climate finances, and so on. And of course, more recently, one of the areas of focus has been the formulation and the implementation of the main climate change public policy, which of course is the NDC, the Nationally Determined Contribution, which is the cornerstone of the Paris Agreement. And Cassie was mentioning the issue of participation. This NDC was done in a very highly participatory manner. I think around 1,000 people from different institutions were involved. So I think that is one of the positive aspects also, that we have this policy anchored in so many sectors in the society. Perhaps the climate promise specifically is contributing to several objectives in Ecuador, because we're now focusing on the implementation of this NDC. So one of the areas of work is the support to a market analysis of NDC action lines that have been prioritized. And this action is identifying investment opportunities and financial strategies and potential funding sources for private actors that are willing to implement climate change initiatives. So this is an example of how the climate promise is leveraging resources, not to increase this ambition of the NDC. It's important to mention also that in this crisis that we're living due to the COVID pandemic, we are of course focusing these efforts to also identify recovery opportunities that could create green jobs and create resilience for cities in the future and for future crises. No? So that's one of the areas of work we do with the climate promise. Another one is on the gender and with a strong youth perspective also. Both of these perspectives were very much present when we supported the formulation of the NDC. And we are also implementing several actions in the follow-up to the formulation. Actually, Cassie mentioned that I don't know how the percentage of NDCs that had a gender action. The NDC of Ecuador actually mainstreamed a gender approach throughout the whole document. And after that, there was a technical roundtable created on gender and climate change with 18 different organizations, no, from the public and private sphere, cooperation and academia, that are now supporting gender responsive climate change policies and strategies. And perhaps one line of action that I would particularly like to highlight, which is very strong in Ecuador, is of course related to land use change and deforestation, which in Latin America is one of the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions. No? So we are supporting the country's efforts to reduce deforestation and forest degradation in alliances with the private sector, NGOs, academia, civil society. And we have been working first with the development of Ecuador's REDD+ action plan, and then the implementation of this plan. And actually, Ecuador is one of the pioneers in the world to implement the REDD+ mechanism according to the UNFCCC rules, and to access the results-based payment from the Green Climate Fund as a recognition of these efforts to reduce deforestation. But I think what is beautiful about these initiatives that we have also is that, well, first I should say they're largely focused on the Amazon, but they do not only contribute to mitigation objectives, not to the reduction of greenhouse gases that emerge from this deforestation and degradation processes, but we also work very, very closely together with indigenous populations and with local communities to strengthen livelihoods, supporting bioeconomy initiatives, connecting markets with deforestation-free commodities. So we are working through these projects with a holistic and multidimensional approach. And so we're responding not only to the environmental objectives of Agenda 2030, to the climate change objectives of the Paris Agreement, but we're also responding to social and economic targets and ambitions. So I think this holistic approach, that engage multiple actors at national and subnational level, and that also involve different sectors, agriculture, environment, energy. I think that is the pathway also to increase this climate change ambition.
Thank you, Matilde, for that. So interesting to hear the interlinkages, how you work cross-sector with lots of partners. And you both mentioned inclusion and the youth perspective, including that as we work towards COP26. And Fredrika, you represent all of Sweden's youth organizations. And so I want to ask you, in your perspective, what does a successful outcome from the conference look like?
Thank you, Marika. And first of all, I want to say it's an honor to be on this panel with such competent colleagues, but also an honor to represent the youth perspective in all of this. A successful outcome of COP26 would be an outcome that reflects the climate emergency that we're in, the climate crisis that we're currently experiencing. In the UNDP People's Climate Vote, a great worldwide survey, you can see that 69% of youth we're convinced that we are in a climate emergency. And we feel that time is running out. Time is running out to ensure that we stay below 1.5 degrees. And why is 1.5 degrees important when we say we should stay below 2 degrees, aiming for 1.5 degrees? Well, it is because it's crucial to avoid tipping points. It's crucial to have a restored nature and not further the risk for human security. And to achieve that 1.5 degree, to limit warming to that number, we must see a demonstration of high ambition on COP26. We've seen a lot of net zero targets being made the past year, which is really rewarding. It's really nice to see. But I also feel that we are those of us who fight for climate issue, we are so starved for action that we get happy about the fact that, okay, half a century away, we're going to curb emissions. But it is not enough. It would be like my parents setting an amazing New Year's resolution, but then handing it over to me to solve it. Because those politicians who set these ambitious targets, they will not be in office when those are pushed through. So what we need to see on COP is also ambitious national determined contributions for 2030 that are in line with these net zero ambitions. But also seeing that we take action already, that we take action today, tomorrow, next year. And to that, it is crucial that the opportunity, the window of opportunity that the COVID-19 crisis, unfortunately, has given the world is used to every extent that is possible. Yesterday, the Swedish Climate Policy Council, a body of scientists that scrutinize the Swedish implementation of our climate goals, they presented a report saying that out of the recovery efforts of Sweden from the COVID-19 pandemic, only 10% would contribute to the climate goals. That is not enough. That is not something that we can have. We need more for a good future for all of us. So how would that ambitious impact be granted at COP26? Well, it also has to do with the form of the conference, that it is a space that takes place. We cannot postpone these negotiations any longer. We need to find solutions to Article 6 that avoids double counting. We need to find solutions to adaptations and to loss and damage. But we also need to make sure that the inclusion of youth, indigenous, marginalized groups is also part of that conference, which during the current circumstances, we know it might look a bit different than it usually does. So to close up, what is a successful outcome of COP26? It is an outcome that guarantees 1.5 degrees warming, a maximum of that. We can't exceed that, by showing that the NDCs that are handed in are in line with the net zero targets, but also that we're using this opportunity that the green recovery means, and that the negotiation can close on those currently very crucial issues to finalize the Paris Agreement, and that we can move to an implementation phase. And to do that, we need the inclusion of civil society. We need the inclusion of youth. We need the inclusion of indigenous people. We need the inclusion of all participants of the world, regardless of our background, regardless of our circumstances. Only then can we guarantee a just, inclusive, and ambitious transition to a better future that is for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Fredrika. We now go over to the Q&A segment of this webinar, and I just want to remind all of the participants that you can submit your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your dashboard. We have gotten in many questions when you registered as well, so we will take a mix of those questions. So first off, I would like to, well, firstly, I think that we have highlighted the situation we're in. We've highlighted how we how we work. We've highlighted what is lacking. And I would like to ask the first question, what do you consider to be the biggest roadblocks or hindrances for enhanced climate ambitions? This can of course be from, your different perspectives, but yes, who would like to begin? The floor is yours. Otherwise, I think maybe I would direct the question to Cassie.
Thanks, Marika. I was just going to raise my hand. Yes, I mean, and I think this question is a really good one because it relates exactly to kind of what we've been talking about in terms of when you ask countries, and when we started the climate promise, we asked countries, what is the hurdle? What do you need to be able to be as ambitious as possible? And what was so interesting about this is that we saw a number of trends that then eventually became the 5 services of the climate promise. And it was everything from increasing levels of transparency to finance to really enhancing what was already in the original NDC to adding additional sectors and greenhouse gases. But one of the most interesting things, and this was the #1 thing that countries asked for, which was building political will and societal ownership. And I thought this was so powerful because we hear a lot about various sort of tools and resources and things that countries need. But the #1 thing was how can we make sure that everyone's a part of the solution, and how can we make sure that we all feel the need to be ambitious about it? And this is where I think some of the big conversations that are going on, a part of the UNFCCC process, a part of sort of bilateral and multilateral diplomacy, play a really key role in helping us all to be as ambitious as possible and to see that we can overcome those hurdles, but we have to do it together.
Thank you, Cassie. Would anyone like to add to the question? Janine, State Secretary.
Thank you, because I think that is a very important question, of course. And as Matilde said, we now have to see how we transform the papers into or if it was Cassie, I'm sorry. We have to transform what's in the papers into reality. And of course, then we need to see what is the obstacles. And I think also that it is the political will and to raise awareness amongst all politicians across all the spectras in any country. And one thing there is what is usually said, listen to the science and to the scientists, as Greta says, because she's very right in that. If you dare to believe in what the science says, everybody gets aware of the urgency that also Fredrika gave a voice to so very good in her remarks here. So and I think that is a perspective we all need to bring and to raise to get a broader understanding from everyone. And I think also it's because it still seems to be expensive. It's expensive to do a green transition, and it's expensive to do this climate investments. But we have to also know that it's so much more expensive not to do it and to ruin the world and make it so much harder to build back. So it is now that it's our time to do this. And I think we have to be very clear about that every time we talk about these things.
Matilde, you raised your hand, and then
yes, I absolutely agree. Cassie, the #1 issue that comes up, the political will and the ownership of society. I think it's remarkable how after so many years we still have this hurdle in front of us, and somehow but it's very much related to the political times. We have. I have been working in Latin America for many years in this field, and I remember many years ago when we started pushing for this, and we were talking about 20-30 years ahead, And there was no politician that wanted to take this on. Now I think there is, of course, more awareness, and we have the crisis upon us, definitely. So there is more sensibility to the issue, but still the political timing is very much focused on votes. And I would say that in this current crisis that we are facing, those votes go through issues related to social protection and economic recovery. And that is not always, there's not what I've seen from here, there's suddenly in this emergency situation, I think many countries are not paying the attention that they could be to the opportunity that this could be for reconstructing. I hear you, Janine, when you're saying that the packages that are being developed in Sweden that include a green recovery lens. This is far from happening in other countries, unfortunately. So I think very much we need to continue with that. Thank you.
And I just jump in and catch up that ball. I believe you're all aiming something very important, talking about societal approval. And I also believe from a youth perspective that climate transition needs to be fair and democratic. Otherwise, it won't happen. It can't be a project of the elites. It has to be a project led by and enhanced by the people. And I think a really important part of that was also raised in the Q&A chat I saw is the Action for Climate Empowerment, the ACE agenda, part of Article 12, where we need to educate and communicate the issue of climate change to civil society and all citizens, but also to listen, because it cannot be a one-way street. It cannot be, okay, we need to make the other ones understand, because we also need to take the knowledge and the experience that are on the ground and put that into climate policy. And one important part of that, from my perspective, is youth inclusion. We need to establish actual institutions, as many of you raised before, not just points in time where youth and civil society can make their voices heard, but make sure that those institutions go on for a long time, and also give the resources for those without a state apparatus backing them up, or without 8 hours per day pay to engage in those issues, to actually make their voices heard, to be able to compete at the level playing field. We need to grant the resources for time, for information, translate things to different languages. Only then, when we grant that inclusion from the whole society, then politicians can be confident and also daring, and knowing that the confident that their inaction will lead to a worse future for all, but also that their action can actually create a better future for all of us.
Thank you. And we've all mentioned, I believe, COVID-19 and, the pandemic's health, humanitarian development issues, economic and socioeconomic consequences. And, with the conference pushed up and everything. But I believe that the pandemic has also created a moment for us to reimagine how we want things to be. What kind of world do you want to live in, basically? And as the world recovers from the pandemic, how do you think that we can integrate climate action into the COVID-19 recovery plans in order to build greener, to build more inclusive, more just? Any raised hands? State Secretary?
Thank you. And yes, I guess this is the big question, and I think we have to have it before our eyes all the time, because we now are in the COVID-19 pandemic. We then have to rebuild society at the same time as we do the sustainable development transition. But they are not 1, 2, 3, they have to be interlinked. And of course, then we have to see that every measure we do in the recovery, we also have to make sure it's a part of being sustainable and building not just better, but also greener. And that, I think it's difficult to point out one thing, but the economy is of course very crucial and a good tool for this, because all the investments we now have to do to restart society after the vaccines are there and we can start going again, we have to make sure that all those investments are green, that they are ensuring that we go emission free and that we build the sustainable future, and not clinging to the old solutions and think that fossil fuels is something we can use for a bit while longer to rebuild now. But we have to make sure that this is interlinked, and no investments in something that will make it harder for us to reach the goals should be accepted.
Fredrika?
I agree, and I'm very happy to hear that from the State Secretary, the sense of urgency. I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has really shown us what we don't want to see happen with climate change. It has shown us to a greater extent how unjust every crisis is, and it doesn't hit everybody to an equal extent. And I think also a lesson is that we cannot procrastinate. I'm a student and I'm an expert at not doing the tasks that I need to do in time, pushing them, and okay, I can take some days off and then I can start studying for that test. But what we've done now is that we've procrastinated the crisis for 26 years, and this is our only chance that we have. So what we need to do is to re-educate everybody who lost their jobs in the COVID-19, make sure, okay, what sector should you go into now that we start up society again? We could invest in great state projects, building out railroads, building out new power systems that are more that climate neutral. See over trade agreements as trade starts back up again, to make sure that we safeguard our foresters, make sure that environmental defenders are safe, and keep fossil fuels in the ground, as Janine expressed. And we do that to ensure that there will be a just transition. That is, I think, the biggest lesson from COVID-19, because we do not want to push climate change nor the climate transition to a similar situation.
Matilde, I saw your hand raised before. Would you like to add? Go ahead.
I wanted to make perhaps first a more global reference and then some examples from the ground. In December 2020, we launched the Global Human Development Report called the Next Frontier of Human Development in the Era of the Anthropocene. And we launched it together with Sweden, actually. And I think it's an incredible report, because it really focuses on how in the first time in human history, instead of how nature has been conditioning and determining human life, we as humans are now shaping the planet. So from this idea, then the report highlights the need to take action, to reduce impacts on nature, to account for the impacts of climate change and development. And well, it's a fantastic report. It has a lot of information. I would actually recommend everyone to have a look at it. It's a great, there's gems for everyone there. But one of the things it does is also introducing a new measure for human development. The Human Development Index that has been around for 30 years, it is in this report now adjusted for planetary pressures, using two main indicators. One is the carbon dioxide emissions per person, and the other is the material footprint per capita. So that accounts for this excessive human pressure on the planet. And you can see how when you introduce this, the countries definitely, they move around. So these countries that are on high human development, when you introduce this planetary pressure, they go down quite drastically. So I think this is important because it's a policy instrument to see where we actually are. And I personally hope that this new adjusted HD index is here to stay, because that is what grasps a broader picture of how we are doing actually globally. No? But going back to the issue of the recovery and COVID-19, as I said previously, what we have been seeing very much here is in Latin America, and I would say in Ecuador, is that in this rush for recovering the economy and for supporting vulnerable populations, there has been very little or practically no space left for taking this opportunity of the crisis to build back better or greener. So there is much to do in this sense. And I do think the international community has a very important role to play here, and the financial community, of course, now in terms of the investments. So one of the things we have been working with as UNDP is, and actually I'm going to another event after this to launch this, we're working with financial institutions to develop green loans, and specifically aimed at the cooperative sectors, which are composed of smaller, more vulnerable businesses. So we have supported the definition of social and environmental standards in this financial sector, and these are used as a lens for lending. And it's also interesting to see that also the private sector, the private banks are taking this up. So, and the next step we will be working is also to stimulate the demand for these types of loans. So we're working on both ends of this. We also supported small businesses in the very early stage of pandemic with their digitalization, but we included guidelines on how to be more environmentally sustainable. We took the opportunity of this particular support for digitalizing and maintaining their businesses, and we had a very severe lockdown for 3 months and then partial lockdowns throughout the year. But we took this opportunity to do also a gender guideline and an environmental guideline. So I think as the donor community, there is a lot of efforts we can support and push for in this sense. So, and again, I think we're grateful for all the support we can get from different donors from the EU, Sweden, Germany is very active here in Ecuador, for instance.
And that ties very much well into a question that we just received. The question is, what role does the private sector have to scale up impact and to achieve climate justice? Would anyone like to respond to that? Cassie?
Thanks, Marika. Certainly, I mean, when we talk about inclusivity and we talk about meeting everyone at the table, the private sector and the different ways that the private sector can invest in various sectors and can help to be a key player in this, again, in sort of this ability to reimagine the future. And certainly within the climate promise of the 118 NDCs that we're working with, 104 mention the private sector. That's an incredible number. And sort of thinking about, and Matilde said this, sort of, the flashback to years ago about what seemed possible then compared to what is possible now. And the fact that NDCs are being seen as this way to bring private sector actors together, and that if we have a country, for example, that has an ambitious energy target, what does it take to achieve that energy target? You need solar panels, wind turbines, you need grids, you need a labor force that, and Fredrika mentioned this, this idea of a just transition, how we can ensure that workers are a key part of this equation. They're not the afterthought, that as we are thinking about how we can achieve this thing like an energy target, that workers are a part of that conversation and a part of the support that is required to be able to make these big moves. And so I think that there's a way that we can start to really bring private sector to the table, especially in sort of when we look at this at a national perspective. Also, I think that there's such a responsibility for some of for all of the major corporations and major finance houses around the world, how money is flowing. And this sort of goes back to the question that you asked as well on the COVID recovery, of the stimulus packages. And we're talking, trillions and trillions of dollars, 12-15 trillion dollars around the world. Right now, only 30% of it is going toward green initiatives. That is just crazy. That is just something that is unacceptable. And I think that as we think about this, you know, figuring out how we can help with these stimulus packages to create a space for the private sector to be able to make the big moves that they need to make, and you know, policy certainty, stability, and investment incentives, de-risking, ways that really help this finance start to flow toward the sectors that align with the Paris Agreement. And that is something that I think a conversation we all need to be a part of.
Absolutely. Would anyone else like to comment on that question? Fredrika?
I can just make a quick comment. I think Cassie captured a lot of it very, very well. But I think also an important part of the inclusion of the private sector is also the polluter pay principle, that the ones companies are responsible for many of the emissions that are causing global warming. And it's not if they would be a part of it, it's that they have to be a part of it. They have to be held accountable, and that is a challenge that we all need to tackle. So companies, what they should do is send signals to their governments. Okay, we want to take responsibilities. You may push further regulations. You may enhance your ambitions. We're on the track. And I also want to just comment the stimulus packages that Cassie mentioned, because that also shows how we have the money. We have the money to give to adaptation. We have the money to give to loss and damages. We have the money to solve the climate crisis, and we have the money to solve the climate crisis twice over, scientists have shown. So really, it is a matter of political will.
State Secretary, go ahead.
Thank you. I mean, I think the private sector is also crucial to make this work and to make it happen, because governments and other official actors, of course, play a big role, but the biggest money is in the private sector. And we have to make all that money moving in the greener direction to reach our goals. And as politicians, I think we might need to just highlight how costly it would be not to do it in the longer run, but maybe also really think about making the incentives for the companies in the private sector to see that it's also better in a shorter run, because maybe most companies make their decisions in a very much shorter time span, and then we have to see that it's good for their economy, or both in a short and in a long term. But without the private sector on this train to the future, I do not think we will make it.
Thank you. So it saddens me to say that we are close to finishing this webinar, and I think I would like to end with one last question to you all as a key takeaway to leave to the audience. What would you say is the key priority to increasing climate action? I will give the first floor to Cassie.
Thanks, Marika. You know, as we talk about sort of the priorities, I'm thinking about and Fredrika mentioned this, that we had done something called the People's Climate Vote, and this was an attempt within NDCs to really start to give the space for people, whether they knew a lot about climate or not, to start to engage in this reimagining exercise. What do they want the future to look like? And the responses were really incredible. 2/3 of people in the world think that climate change is a global emergency. And then we asked them, the top ways that they want their government to solve it. And the top 4 were protecting forests and land, renewable energy, climate-friendly farming, and green jobs. And what this really says, and I think this goes to your question about the key priority, is that the way that we need to address climate change has to be very place specific. All four of those things that people voted for were very, very different, but it's because people are looking around and they're seeing the climate crisis in real time, and they're being affected by the climate crisis in real time, and they're seeing the solutions in a way that is really based on where they are. And I think being able to figure out how we can help real acceleration across all of these priorities is something that is our challenge as being a part of the fight in this crisis. And I think that figuring out the ways that we can help people to be a part of these solutions, no matter where they are, is something that I think should be a really key priority. So, thanks.
Matilde?
Yes, maybe, I mean, there's so many sectors, and thank you, Cassie, for giving us the four top, but maybe taking another approach to this. I think one of the priorities in this is participation. And we have been doing this. Now, I mentioned how we did this in Ecuador with the NDC formulation that included like 1,000 different persons from different institutions, private sector, public, academia, civil society. We're also working with the private sector on business roundtable, marketplaces, etc. And perhaps to just very shortly give an example that I think is fantastic is exactly in terms of the reduction of deforestation and degradation of forest is the roundtable for REDD+ that exists in Ecuador since 2012 and now has 47 members from all sectors of society, including logging companies, but there's also 11 indigenous populations organizations that are part of this REDD roundtable that have been able to influence public policy, and they're ensuring that the benefits go to their own populations and the local communities. And I think that participation is also what makes these different sectoral priorities move forward.
Fredrika, go ahead.
Thank you. And I also believe, as raised by Matilde, that inclusion and getting everybody on board is such an important part of this transition. But I also want to raise the issue of time. I think the key priority is urgency. Perhaps we believe that we should just investigate a bit more and know a bit more before we take action, but we cannot wait. We have to take action, even though some solutions will come in a couple of years. Some solutions will emerge as we take action, but it has to happen now. We don't have the time to wait.
Thank you. And I think that one of the key issues and the key priorities is to make people see that this is important for them in their daily lives, and it can really make their future better, and that there are solutions to this as long as we do it together and we work hard. Because if people are in it, businesses are in it, society, civil society, and the governments, then we really have a chance to make an impact. And we have to make people believe that and not seeing it as something that is impossible for the future to come, because we do not have time to wait. Thank you.
So before I wrap up this seminar, I would just like to ask the participants to please check the chat box where we have a feedback survey. It would be fantastic if you could share your feedback with us to let us know how we did. And to sum up, the key priorities are listening to the people, making sure solutions are localized in the context, participation, the urgency that we're in right now, and working together and making people believe that this is, something we have to work on right now. And so without further ado, I just want to thank on behalf of UNDP Sweden, thank you to you, your brilliant speakers, and to all the participants that listened in today. Thank you.